Good evening, and welcome to the Marian Miner Cook Athenaeum. My name is Michael Grauske, and I am one of this year's Ath Fellows. While Nazi Germany's appalling crimes against the Jewish people during the 1930s and 40s are widely known, the Holocaust victims also included millions of non-Jews, homosexuals, Roma, political prisoners, and many others. For homosexuals in particular, it is estimated that anywhere between 5 and 10,000 individuals were imprisoned in concentration camps, and according to one scholar, the death rate in these camps may have been as high as 60%. Following the Holocaust, there was a systematic movement to bring perpetrators to justice and compensate victims. But at least initially, such reconciliation excluded homosexuals. It was not until 2002 that the German government apologized to the gay community. Tonight's speaker, Jeffrey Giles, is an expert on German and European history who has focused his research on the mistreatment and victimization of homosexuals during and after the Holocaust. Dr. Giles has played a leading role in Holocaust education, facilitating seminars for college faculty at important historical sites throughout Poland, the Czech Republic, and Germany. In 2000, Dr. Giles spent a year as the senior scholar in residence at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Dr. Giles received his PhD in history from the University of Cambridge before completing a 4-year postdoc fellowship at Yale. He taught courses on German and European history at the University of Florida for 35 years before retiring as a professor emeritus in 2013. I've also been told that Dr. Giles is known to some as Sir Geoffrey, just as long as you don't ask the British government. Professor Giles' Athenaeum Talk is co-sponsored by the Magrublian Center for Human Rights. As always, audio and visual recording is prohibited. Please welcome Dr. Giles to the Athenaeum.
Thank you very much for that. It's a pleasure to be back at Claremont McKenna. I was first here in the year 2000 when most of you were still in diapers. And I then stayed in a guest house on campus, and I was told that the week before the bed had been slept in by Kenneth Starr, who was the vicious prosecutor against Bill Clinton, which I find rather creepy. So nothing creepy about this visit, I'm very happy to say. And it's always a pleasure to be back with my very good friends, Wendy Lauer and Jonathan Petropoulos. I looked at the website and I found that my talk this evening is scheduled to last from 5:30 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. So, assuming that you don't want to listen to me for 24 hours, I conclude that my presentation is probably to last for 1 minute. I was going to talk about the law against homosexuals in Nazi Germany and so on, but I decided to do something different, and I want to actually talk about individuals who were targeted by the Nazis, and in particular some very interesting and surprising material that I found about Jews who were accused of homosexual offenses after the beginning of the war, when one would expect them to be bundled off to a concentration camp immediately, and that did not always happen. We have to remember that the court system, the justice system, was separate from the Gestapo. The Gestapo could send people to concentration camps without even going before a magistrate, without a trial, just scoop them up and send them off to Dachau or wherever. The court system was rather different, as we'll see, and some of these Jews received rather lenient sentences, much to my surprise, and we'll investigate the story of some of these individuals. But first of all, I need to say something about the Criminal Code and paragraph 175. This was the section of the criminal Code dealing with homosexual offenses. And it was put in place in 1871 when the German Empire was founded, much to the opposition of some of the southern states which had been more lenient after their attack by Napoleon and his reform of the law. They were forced to add the Prussian paragraph 175, criminalizing homosexual activity, which was not criminalized in France and in other countries. The law was interesting because it was very vague, and it criminalized quote, unnatural indecency. That was not really defined more closely, but what repeated appeals to the Supreme Court ruled was that the lawyers had to prove penetrative intercourse to win a conviction. That was usually anal sex, sometimes oral sex. Unless that could be proven, which was very difficult to do, because when two men or men and women have sex, there usually is not an audience, and they do it in private. So all they had to do was to say, we didn't do this, we just masturbated, and they could not be sent to prison. And state prosecutors got very upset about this. They wasted a lot of time trying to get convictions and failed to do so. And in the 1920s, as Germany became the El Dorado, as it was called, of gay and lesbian life, they formed groups to bring a backlash against the liberalization of society, and the Nazis latched onto that, and by 1935 changed the law, which no longer spoke of unnatural indecency, but simply indecency. So this was an even vaguer term. They didn't talk about this in the press because they didn't want to put ideas of sexual experimentation into the minds of young people, but this meant that any kind of even mild homosexual advances, homoerotic advances, just simply touching somebody, certainly kissing somebody, would land you in jail with a conviction. So that's just a very brief outline of the paragraph. And I'm going to talk about men. We can talk about this in the Q&A afterwards. Lesbians were not included in this law because they weren't thought to be a threat to society. I should just mention also that after the beginning of the war, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Gestapo and the SS, ruled that someone who had served out a prison sentence, if he had had sex with more than one person, would not be released, as legally he should have been, but transferred to a concentration camp for an indefinite period. And this often meant, because indeed 2/3 of the gay prisoners, the Pink Triangle prisoners, did not survive, this was almost tantamount to a death sentence. They were singled out by the guards. In particular, in Sachsenhausen, there was a campaign of murder, particularly of the Pink Triangle prisoners in 1942. So brief outline there. And I'm sort of titling this paper, I have a general paper that title that you've seen. I'm going to refer to sort of double jeopardy. So these people were doubly targeted as Jews and as homosexuals. And I want to, as I say, give you a flavor of what actually happened and usually the mildness of the activity, which we wouldn't really regard as a particularly serious criminal offense. So we know really very little about the fate of captured Jewish homosexuals in Nazi Germany. And perhaps that's not surprising, because if they survived the war, they still felt deep shame about their sexuality in a repressive post-war society and remained silent. And Holocaust scholars tend to regard them as a separate category from mainstream Jewish persecution, and often as a simply unmentionable one. Gad Beck, perhaps the best-known victim, author of the Memoirs of a Gay Jew, was not at all typical. He was never arrested, and he later boasted that he'd had the best sex of his life during the war. Beck was a half-Jew, and so exempted from deportation. Even if fully Jewish homosexuals remained out of sight during the Third Reich, that would not have saved them, as it did most of Germany's 3 to 4 million homosexuals. These are figures that the Nazis accepted. They only ever managed to find and arrest 100,000 men as suspected homosexuals. So most gay men managed to stay out of sight. They wouldn't have been protected, the Jewish homosexuals, because they would have been caught up in the sweeping anti-Jewish legislation. But they must have been a significant group. In 1933, even 3%, which is a fairly low estimate of the number of gay men in society, even 3% of Germany's 500,000 Jews would have represented 15,000 gay Jews. And my research into this topic in Berlin turned out to be very surprising even to me. For example, despite the toughening measures against Jews following Kristallnacht in 1938, Jewish identity did not automatically lead to harsher treatment for men arrested for homosexual offenses. Again, as I said, we've got to remember that Himmler's Gestapo operated outside the law and could send anybody simply to a concentration camp without a warrant. But inside the courts and inside the prisons of the German justice system, there was still, despite an often crass manipulation of evidence, the rump elements of a concern to be seen to apply the law equitably. And that's really the point of my paper, that there was no blanket treatment, no automatic worst case sentencing of homosexuals, even of homosexual Jews. Sometimes the courts chose to believe the worst about an accused Jew, despite the presence of unreliable accusers and shaky evidence, but then sometimes accepted extenuating circumstances to lessen a sentence. A young man called Alfred S., and I'm just going to give the initial letter of the surnames. Alfred was arrested at the end of May 1939 and charged with being a male prostitute. He was Jewish and 14 years old. On that day, he happened to be close to the Potsdamer Platz, the Potsdam Square in Berlin, and a stranger asked him the way to the Potsdam train station. Well, it was right there. And he couldn't really have mistaken that. So he walked along for a short distance with a stranger who then bought him a soda in a nearby bar. We then find that they slipped away probably to a restroom and masturbated each other, but were evidently disturbed and arrested. Alfred, 14 years old, admitted under police interrogation that he had acted similarly on 4 previous occasions in order to obtain some pocket money. And I've found this again and again, that young men did not think that this sort of sexual activity was particularly serious, and they needed pocket money, often just to go to the movies, to get a movie ticket. They got a few pennies for a ticket, and they thought it was no big deal. The court now, or the police now, charged him with a very serious crime. Quote from the transcripts: "The accused has engaged in male prostitution since the age of 11." Unquote. However, the court adopted a surprisingly sympathetic view of this immature schoolboy who had indeed not made this his regular occupation for the last 3 years. The state prosecutor demanded a prison sentence of 2 months, but in the end the youth court handed down a sentence of a mere 7 weeks. But he'd already been remanded in custody for 7.5 weeks before the trial, which was to be counted towards his sentence, and this led to his immediate release. The court had acted with good sense and generosity. But Himmler's Gestapo could not be counted on to exhibit the same virtues. And in the files that I originally saw, I thought this was a happy end to the story, but then I did some further research in other sources and found that 3 years later, in August 1942, he was loaded onto deportation transport number 18 to Riga. We know that despite a serious shortage of slave labor, none of the 938 Jews on that train was taken to the Riga ghetto, Rather, all were marched straight into the forest on arrival and shot, as were 1,000 Jews from Theresienstadt a few days later. Alfred was then 18 years old and could have provided a useful pair of hands for the German labor needs. Martin H. was 43 years old when he was arrested in August 1939, just before the outbreak of the war. He was the manager of a warehouse for the Jewish community in Berlin and had served honorably in the First World War and won the Iron Cross second class. He was single and enjoyed spanking young teenage boys, sometimes on their bare bottom. He had already been accused of this in 1926 in connection with boys in the sports club that he ran, but no criminal charges had been pressed. Now he was indicted on suspicion of similar offenses with 4 teenagers in the shady district around the Alexanderplatz in Berlin, where one of them had probably pointed him out as a regular customer to the police on one of their neighborhood patrols. The inquiries of the local youth office revealed all 4 boys, who were aged between 13 and 15, to be male prostitutes. So there could be no question of his having seduced or corrupted them. Indeed, they were all packed off to a youth detention center. And Martin made a full confession, noting that once he had spanked one boy, the others pestered him whenever he walked down Memhart Street, hoping for some pocket money, running after him and not letting him go until he had succumbed to temptation again. Probably thinking that the spanking, sometimes a little groping, would not be regarded as a serious sex crime, he stressed that he was just completing the formalities for his emigration to Shanghai and expected to leave the country within 4 weeks. Emigration was, after all, what the Nazis hoped at this time the Jews would undertake. But the police did not want him to flee the country and kept him under arrest. Martin was brought to trial in December 1939. Despite growing anti-Semitism, once the war had begun, the judges refrained from any vituperative remarks about the accused. They agreed that his full confession counted in his favor and admitted that no great harm had come to the boys because they were already corrupted. And he had no previous convictions. Nonetheless, he was Jewish and should have, quote, kept his distance from children of German blood, unquote. He would have to go to prison for 2 years. But the 4 months he'd already spent in custody could be counted towards this. Accordingly, he was released in August 1941. But the form in the archives authorizing this suggests that he was not set free, but sent to criminal police headquarters, run by Heinrich Himmler. And this occurred because he now came up against Himmler's decree of July 1940 that, quoting from the decree, all homosexuals who have seduced more than one partner following their release from prison are to be taken into security confinement, unquote. What this meant was that such men were not to be freed after all, having served out their sentence, but transferred, as I said, indefinitely and illegally to a concentration camp for so-called preventive detention in order to protect the public from any future possible offense. Even though he'd hardly seduced these 4 rent boys, he was transferred to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp north of Berlin, where he died on the 23rd of March the following year, in a week when one homosexual prisoner died almost every day, but before the enhanced campaign that summer of murder by the SS guards and the death of at least 89 Pink Triangle inmates in the month of July alone. I'm going to talk about a rather longer case. Someone called Egon S., was 42 years old when convicted of homosexual assault in December 1939, so the war had begun. He worked behind the counter of a tobacconist's shop in Berlin, been born in 1897 to Jewish parents, and was a decorated war veteran who'd lost a foot, had damaged his left hand, and suffered severe depression from head wounds in the First World War. He was in and out of clinics throughout the 1920s. In 1929, he married one of the nurses, but the marriage does not sound like a very happy one, and by September 1935, they were no longer having sex. Egon had only ever had gay sex twice in his life before this. The first time, he'd been seduced by an ensign during the First World War, and later, in 1931, he fell prey to the charms of a male prostitute when traveling in Italy. Both cases involved no more than mutual masturbation, which was not a criminal offense at the time. It only became that in 1935 when the Nazis tightened paragraph 175 to include any act that could be considered indecent. By 1939, he was taking a new drug for his ailments, Pervitin, to boost his stamina, but the medication also worked to lower his inhibitions. Today, this drug is known as speed. Egon was friendly with his customers and occasionally slipped some of the neighborhood youths a few cigarettes when they stopped by the shop. In July 1939, he invited one of them, the 17-year-old Georg E., to come to his apartment to listen to the Max Schmeling boxing match on the radio. His wife was apparently away for the weekend. He gave Georg some food and then some cigarettes and settled down on the sofa beside him. Egon asked if Georg was ticklish and began tickling him. Then opened his fly buttons and took out his penis. Georg quickly said that he needed to take a pee and left the room. When he returned, the advances were repeated, and Egon masturbated him while talking of the brothels and the sex during the Great War in France, trying to excite him, but without success. Georg said he ought to go, and Egon sent him on his way with 25 cigarettes and 5 marks in change. So this had not been a violent sexual attack, and the young kid had kind of let it go on as far as it did, but he was not really interested. During that same month, Egon struck up in the shop with a friend of Georg's, Nikolaus von S. He had an aristocratic-sounding name, but was in fact a 16-year-old apprentice auto mechanic who often could not even be bothered to turn up for work. His father, a movie actor, had requested help from the local welfare office since his son was proving so idle and difficult. Shortly after this, Nikolaus made himself known to Egon, perhaps hearing about the possibility of free cigarettes from his friend Georg. And indeed, Egon took him out for drinks on several occasions. Not long afterwards, the pair met up in the town of Stettin and shared a room in a hotel with 2 single beds for the night. Egon climbed into Nikolaus's bed and began tickling and then masturbated him. Finding no response from the young man, he tried again a little later, but Nikolaus, who had indeed no interest in this, told him to stop because he was tired. A third attempt in the morning again produced no response. So not only was this again not a particularly violent sexual assault, but Nikolaus was so unfazed as to go to movies together with Egon twice subsequently after they'd returned to Berlin. So he was not sort of horrified or frightened by this. However, his father had become suspicious of the relationship and again visited the welfare office in August to report that he believed his son was getting into bad company with this friendly tobacconist. The welfare officer immediately suspected a homosexual relationship and encouraged the father to report the case to the Gestapo. Here then is a typical example of the reason for the arrest of most homosexuals in Nazi Germany, a denunciation by a member of the public. The police acted quickly and arranged for Nikolaus to follow through with another date for a movie 2 days later, at which Egon could be arrested on the spot. Both youths were brought in for interrogation the same day, and the police officer who conducted the interviews found both of them to have made a decent impression and concluded that they had been seduced, although he could not, quote, understand how they had in part tolerated the behavior of Egon. Egon himself made a full confession there and then, even admitting that he was not, as a Jew, permitted to enter a movie theater with Nikolaus, but also insisting that he was not a homosexual. Egon's wife, Ottilie, wrote a surprisingly supportive letter requesting his release from jail prior to the actual trial, noting that she had been wanting to divorce him for some time, and this would allow him time to settle his affairs. She noted that as a Jew he had no passport and so would be unable to flee the country. The request was ignored, whereupon she had the head of the clinic where she'd worked and he'd been a patient send a confidential medical report on her husband. In it, the doctor stated that he had observed, quote, not all that infrequently in his psychiatric practice that patients suffering from depression who took certain drugs to relieve this experienced a loosening or even a loss of the usual protective barriers against abnormal behavior. This could certainly be the case with the regular use of Pervitin. And his Jewish defense counsel likewise attested that Pervitin that he'd been taking for months on end was a new drug for which the long-term effects were not as yet known, and this had made him therefore not mentally responsible for his actions. But when the trial took place in December of 1939, the court rejected the plea of mental incompetency, which could have acquitted him, and the verdict sharpened up the evidence somewhat. The very first sentence of the judgment read, "The accused is a Jew in the sense of the Nuremberg laws," which immediately set a negative tone. It then claimed that he had, quote, on his own admission, already in years past occasionally engaged in homosexual activities, unquote, whereas we know that there were only 2 isolated instances. The court also noted, but could not wholly accept as proven, the suggestion that the 2 young friends had on earlier occasions masturbated each other. It was also not sure what to do with the claim that Georg, in rebuffing Egon during the first groping and being more interested in the boxing match, had said, quote, "There's time for this in the evening." That suggested that he was not totally opposed to the sex, had no need to be seduced, and knew the name of the game well enough. It had also come to light that Nikolaus was acquainted with another man suspected of being a homosexual. While admitting that this granted him some clemency, and also in light of his war wounds and his full confession, at the same time the court felt that he, as a Jew, should have believed that he was, quote, especially bound to respect the laws created for the protection of youth. It handed down a total of 1 year in prison, not a particularly heavy sentence, but allowed the time spent in jail to count towards that, thus knocking off more than 3 months. I think such a sentence for a Jew, and during the war at that, seems to be a rather mild and indeed balanced one. He was due for release from prison in August 1940, but now he too fell under Himmler's July edict from the month before, ordering transfer to a concentration camp, since he had at least attempted to seduce more than 1 youth. Egon was sent to Sachsenhausen, to the special barracks hut for homosexuals, where the lights were switched on all night long and the inmates were required to sleep with their hands outside the blankets. Frequent random inspections throughout the night were designed to prevent any illicit sexual activity. Egon lasted there for another year, but in June 1941, he was loaded onto a transport for the mental hospital at Sonnenstein, where he was killed in the gas chamber along with 1,300 other supposedly incurable mental patients in that month alone. So here we have a fairly lenient treatment at the hands of the justice system, which nonetheless meant that you were not completely out of the woods. And in the Third Reich, homosexuals were indeed sometimes labeled as mentally handicapped individuals. The Nazis always viewed hairdressers with suspicion. They had all kinds of stereotypes, waiters, hairdressers, whom they suspected were all probably gay. And there was neighborhood talk that Karl R. was what was referred to as a warm brother. This was a euphemism for homosexuals, despite the fact that he was married. As part of an investigation in May 1941, his former apprentice, Rudolf S., was questioned and revealed that the hairdresser admitted that he didn't get along with his wife at all well, or with the mother-in-law that lived with them. He felt he had no close friend and began to treat young Rudolf as a friend with trips to the movies, with beer, with cigarettes, and so on. And in October 1937, just before his 15th birthday, Karl had indeed masturbated him 2 or 3 times a week for the next 3 years, till he passed his apprenticeship exam, which was now, under the new law from 1935, a very serious case of sexual assault with someone in a position of authority over a young man. Rudolf also caught the eye of Albert S., who came regularly to the shop to be shaved. Born in 1885, he happened to be Jewish and was indeed a serial sex offender with 3 convictions for assaulting children under the age of 14 in 1924, 1929, and 1939. The last case had condemned him to 2.5 years in a penitentiary, a 1,000-mark fine, and castration. Young Rudolf had revealed in his interrogation that Albert had once locked the door of his haberdasher's shop and refused to let him out until he'd masturbated him. So he was a new offense, and in June 1941, Albert was hauled out for questioning in the Gurden Penitentiary, where he was serving time for previous offenses. This is a prison that is actually still used in Germany for sex offenders today. He denied Rudolf's accusations, but a further and doubtless none too gentle interrogation in September made him confess to this and to 2 other offenses with unknown 19 to 20-year-old men in 1938 before his arrest in May that year. By this time, he was transferred under Himmler's multiple offenders edict to the concentration camp at Buchenwald. His interrogation there had taken place on the 6th of September 1941, and by the 24th of that month, a formal indictment for these 3 new offenses was mailed to him. Unfortunately, he was too late. Albert had already died 2 days after the interrogation, almost certainly murdered by the SS guards at Buchenwald. Jews and homosexuals were 2 of the groups most despised and ill-treated by the camp guards, and Albert was both of these. A 53-year-old Erwin H. was arrested in September 1941 on the very day when he would have to start wearing the Jewish yellow Star of David badge. He had tried to fondle a 19-year-old youth, but didn't get very far. His accuser, Kurt S., only bothered to press charges 5 months later, but then asserted that Erwin had paid him 700 marks for his silence. But then he retracted that story. The young man later went to the police station with stab wounds in his calf and a claim that he'd been attacked by associates of Erwin as revenge for blackmail. But he subsequently admitted that the wounds were self-inflicted to make his fictional story more plausible. This case is interesting for a couple of reasons. First, the court indeed sent Erwin to prison for 18 months for sexual assault. And under interrogation, he'd also admitted fondling with another Jewish man while fully clothed in a park some 2 or 3 years earlier. However, the court surprisingly chose to acquit him altogether of that offence, despite his confession, because no solid evidence could be presented. Moreover, it could have handed down a penitentiary sentence on the grounds that he tried to seduce someone under the age of 21, but the court was not convinced that Erwin knew Kurt's, 19-year-old Kurt's age. Now, this was a dangerous time in the fall of 1941 for German Jews because the deportations to the east had begun a couple of weeks earlier, after his arrest. Paradoxically, he might have been safer if he'd been in prison than sitting at home, but he figured the opposite was true. Right after the sentence, he was allowed to enter the Jewish hospital for an operation on a corneal rupture and an inflammation of his inner ear, his middle ear. His name had indeed been included on a selection list of deportees at this time, but was removed since he was in hospital. The fiction, of course, was that the deportees were being taken to perform labor in the rural east, for which they needed to be fit and healthy. Erwin managed to stay in hospital for more than 3 months, until the end of December, thus delaying his trial. Meanwhile, Kurt, the main prosecution witness, who appears to me to have been a male prostitute, had been conscripted into the army and could therefore not be brought back from the front to testify in court. Once he got wind of this, Erwin promptly retracted his confession that he had perhaps forcibly assaulted Kurt. The judges were furious about this. It had been enough, they said, that, quote, he as a Jew had even dared to satisfy his sexual lust on a German, unquote. But now changing his version of the facts of the case showed him, quote, wriggling back and forth in a typically Jewish manner. And he therefore deserved a severe punishment. However, Erwin did not go immediately to prison. He claimed he still needed medical treatment, which the prison doctors would not have given to a Jew, and therefore he was able to remain at large. 6 months later, at the end of July, he was summoned to appear at the prison infirmary for a medical examination to determine whether he was now fit enough to be incarcerated. Here again, we see a surprising adherence to the proper rules and regulations. Erwin failed to turn up, instead writing an apology to say that his near blindness, his problem with his eyes, was now so bad that he needed a guide to help him and to accompany him to the prison. He'd indeed booked one, but the man fell sick the day before, and it was too late then to engage another one. 3 weeks later, he was simply ordered to turn himself in at the prison on the 1st of September. That written summons was sent on the 24th of August, and on the 30th, Erwin wrote back, apologizing and saying that the letter had only reached him that day because he changed his address. Could he please be granted some extra time? Because his teeth were now giving him trouble and he needed to be treated by a dentist. Perhaps another 3 weeks would suffice, in which he promised to continue his eye and his ear treatments and report to start his prison sentence on the 20th of September. So one has a strong suspicion that he was somehow cleverly, perhaps desperately, playing the system. And it seemed to be working. 1 month later, on the 20th of October, the prison authorities were still looking for him. Erwin had disappeared again. But unfortunately, as I found through further research, this was his last move, because he had been now bundled into a cattle car for deportation to the east. His request for a delay had been denied, and he was picked up and incarcerated the following week, not, however, by the regular police and the justice system, but by the Gestapo, who turned up at his apartment 3 weeks later to confiscate his belongings, notifying the local police of his deportation. He'd been sent to Tallinn in Estonia, known as Reval back then, where he is presumed to have been killed. Word had not been passed to the prison service, which was holding a cell ready for him for 3 weeks after that. So this does not seem to be a case where the justice authorities grew so fed up with him that they arranged to send him to his death. Rather, it shows, I think, to me, that the various branches of the police, the prison service, and the SS were not in collusion, but in these vast bureaucracies, the right hand sometimes did not know what the left hand was doing. Let me talk about. Yeah, sorry, Siri. Let's go away. Let me skip a bit so that we have more time for Q&A. Maybe one more case. Siegfried D. was an illegitimate child who'd been brought up from birth by his Christian grandparents. They must have concealed the fact that his actual father was Jewish, because Siegfried had actually served in the junior section of the Hitler Youth, even becoming a patrol leader, but he stopped attending when he graduated from his elementary school at Easter 1939 at the age of 14. At this time, he found a position as a delivery boy in a local store. He was a completely unreliable employee, and the firm was pleased to see him called up for compulsory labor service in April 1942. Following his departure from the store, they found several packages abandoned in his locker, which he'd simply been too lazy to deliver to the customers. And somehow it emerged within a few weeks that he had attempted to fondle the genitals of 6 different youths in the year or so after he'd left school, variously in movie theaters or on overnight camping trips. All of them were close neighbors whom he knew, living within a block of his own home, and all of them had refused his advances. So that no indecent act had ever been completed. But the attempt, just the attempt, was now a criminal offense. And the fact that a couple of the boys were under the age of 14 made it even more serious. Nevertheless, his Jewish heritage seems to have counted for less than the fact that his grandfather was an officer at the local police station. And in the deposition, Marx complaining that Siegfried's grandmother had totally spoilt the boy and made him soft, the police lieutenant noted that, quote, such misconduct, he means masturbation, such misconduct was no rarity at this youthful age. There's an appreciation that this kind of thing happens frequently with teenage boys. It had always been so, would always remain the case. The court met to consider these crimes in May of 1942, just at the same time when 1,500 Jews from Sosnowitz were being gassed at Auschwitz. The prosecutor demanded a 3-month prison sentence, but there was some reluctance to interrupt his labor service, which it was hoped would help the youth to shape up somewhat. With his Jewish heritage, he shouldn't have been taking part in this labor service, but the Christian grandparents seem to have helped here. And in the end, the court merely imposed a 1-month sentence, but not in prison, but in the less harsh conditions of a juvenile detention center. It would have been relatively easy to paint this young man as a Jewish sexual predator. The deportations of Berlin Jews had already begun 8 months earlier, in October 1941, but not of the so-called Mischlinge, people of mixed race with not all Jewish family members. And these connections with the Christian people who brought him up probably helped, even though the welfare authorities were critical of the youth's undisciplined upbringing in the home of someone who was a policeman. So in conclusion, to discover the ultimate fate of some of the other Jewish homosexuals I've investigated, when or if they were released from prison, and whether they survive will require much more research. And yet a pattern has emerged. Until the start of the war, there was sometimes a willingness on the part of the courts to treat non-violent offences as a deplorable indiscretion, meriting no more than a moderate prison sentence, especially for those under the age of 21. But during the war, the situation became much more unpredictable and indeed grave, even before the formal start of genocide in 1941. For these were not just Jews, but also homosexuals, who were thought to be capable of spreading this disease like an epidemic, and therefore had to be eradicated. The Ministry of Justice did not deal with this as radically as the Nazi Party machine. The Minister of Justice, Franz Gürtner, was a conservative who was only persuaded to join the Nazi Party as late as 1937. And despite endorsing many anti-Jewish measures, he nonetheless strove to keep the justice system independent of party and especially police influence until his death in January 1941. During the war, the SS and police under Heinrich Himmler were happy to step back and allow prisoners to serve out their jail sentences, but then swooped in to gather up certain categories like homosexuals for transfer to the lethal conditions of the concentration camps. Or they simply added them to the lists of deportation to the extermination sites in the East. I've found no clues yet indicating that they were preferentially selected for their alleged homosexuality rather than simply being Jewish. However, for Jewish homosexuals, there can be no question that they stood under double jeopardy. Thank you. So I'm happy to answer questions.
If you have a question, please raise your hand and Sarah and I will come to you.
I actually have a question. Can you start by talking about the lesbians and why they weren't considered a threat?
Yeah, I talked about this in the class this afternoon a little bit. In Britain in the 19th century, one of Queen Victoria's ladies-in-waiting was found to be engaged in a lesbian relationship. And Queen Victoria was told, and she said, "Oh, I didn't know that women did that sort of thing." And it's kind of the same in Germany, that because the law, the Supreme Court, based the success of convictions on penetrative intercourse, the men in the Justice Ministry, the lawyers, couldn't quite figure out what women did with each other. And they just wouldn't fit the template of penetrative sex. So they were left out. The other reason that they were not included under the Nazis, who kind of wanted to, was that they feared a lot of false denunciations. But the real reason was that women, even if they were lesbians, could still be made pregnant against their will, if need be, to produce babies to swell the ranks of Hitler's armies. The other reason being that women were not really part of the elite in Nazi Germany. They were very much second-class citizens. And the part of the rationale behind the persecution of homosexuals was that because this was an epidemic, it was spread throughout the elite, and before long, the country would basically be run by homosexuals because they would recruit other gay men into the upper reaches of the government and the party and so on. Women were not in the upper reaches of the government or party. They were not allowed to be, And so they didn't pose this threat against the state. They wanted to include lesbians under the law, paragraph 175, after the beginning of the war, but there was an embargo on new laws until the war had been successfully won, which they thought was going to happen at any moment throughout the war. And so they decided to wait, and they would then possibly include them. Some women who were lesbians were indeed taken to the concentration camp at Ravensbrück, north of Berlin, but not made to wear a pink triangle because this was not part of paragraph 175. They were simply declared to be asocial and wore a black triangle. But there are not very many of them, and research on that has been rather skimpy. The best work has been done by Claudia Schoppmann, whose work has been partly translated into English. There are a couple of books there. And she found and interviewed and got testimony from a number of lesbians. Then there's the famous movie, Amy and Jaguar, about a lesbian relationship during the war, which is well worth seeing. Yeah.
I'm struck by the fact that many of the cases you brought up were youth cases. And the issue of the Nazi desire to educate. So to what extent did they think that this was something that re-education could solve versus a genetic disorder? And why, to what extent did they publicize, say, the change of the paragraph 175 law from natural indecency to indecency? So some of these cases, the young people came in, and as you quoted them, they said, well, I didn't know this was an indecent act. So how did people know what was an offense or not an offense, in contrast to the Nuremberg laws, in which it was clearly defined, in Nazi terms, who was or wasn't a Jew?
Yeah, it was explicitly stated in 1935, we will not talk about this in the press. We're not going to have articles explaining the new law, because this will tend to encourage sexual experimentation against young people, with young people, and they may actually be recruited into the ranks of homosexuals, so we don't want to talk about it. We particularly don't want to talk about it in the youth, because they're in these sort of single-sex camping situations and so on. This is the kind of thing that may go on, as we know already went on in the youth movements before the Nazi period. In fact, the big wave of opposition to non-Nazi youth movements in the 1930s was carried out partly under the accusation that they were just rife with homosexual activity. And that was publicized, as were the trials against Catholic priests and monks in the late 30s, which were then scaled back because the public simply did not believe that every other Catholic priest was seducing the choir boys. And the parishioners often came to the defense of these religious men. But repeatedly they said that we can't really talk about this. In the SS, after the beginning of the war, Himmler decided that every SS man had to sign a piece of paper saying that he understood the law against homosexual offenses and promised not to succumb to this. Well, it turns out that again and again, right through to the end of the war, SS men who are prosecuted and interrogated said, well, we never signed this. We didn't know about this. Our officers never talked about it. There was, of course, during the war, a paper shortage. And so they just didn't have the paper to print all these forms for thousands and thousands of SS men to sign. And so the attempt to educate even a certain sector of the Nazi movement just collapsed. But the main reason is they were timid about sex education in general, but particularly about being too explicit about homosexual activity.
Thank you.
You're competing here, yeah.
Okay, sorry. So you mentioned that they saw homosexuals as these incurable mental patients, some of them?
Sometimes, yeah.
Sometimes. And so I'm wondering, it's widely known that the Holocaust was an extermination of Jews, and the people in the time, as they were realizing that, some tried to leave and escape. Did some homosexuals or other maybe mentally ill people try to leave as well? Like, was it more fruitful to try to escape, or was it more fruitful to deny that you were homosexual?
I mean, I don't think people could get out of the country because they were in some way mentally handicapped or homosexual. I mean, that would have meant difficulties in getting a visa in other countries, probably. As we know from some very good work by distinguished historians, the campaign to exterminate the mentally handicapped was a dummy run for the extermination of Jews. Many of you know that the gas chambers were first used there. What is perhaps surprising is that suspected homosexuals were sometimes sent to these mental asylums with a view to including them in the assignment to the gas chambers. So in terms of getting out, well, yeah, some did, but that was as a result of having acquaintances or friends or family abroad, getting the necessary visa. I mean, just as difficult as it was for anyone else. And as you may know, some of you in your Holocaust studies, it became more and more difficult to leave the country without abandoning most of your assets. This started off as a pre-Nazi law that you had to leave a certain percentage of your assets. They wanted to try and prevent the exodus of capital from the country. But by the beginning of the war, if you wanted to leave the country and you were lucky enough to get a visa, you basically had to surrender to the government, the German government, about 90% of your assets. If you sold your home, you sold your car, and so on. And so you would the choice was you either stayed and hoped that the Nazis would collapse, or you went abroad with no money, not speaking the foreign language, without a job, and so on. And this is a big and difficult decision for people to do this. And the hope always was, it'll get better. You know, even though I'm Jewish, I am a First World War veteran, I've got the Iron Cross, I fought, I sacrificed for my country, they're not going to do anything to me. And you know, when the deportation started, a lot of Jews put the Iron Cross on their breast pocket or their lapel, assuming that they would be treated well by the Nazis, but not realizing that this was not the case. Yeah, we had a question over here next, I think. Did we? Did we have that? Jonathan, you take precedence, apparently.
Jeffrey, I was struck in your fascinating talk that in every case study, the individual died or perished.
Yeah.
And my understanding was that during the Third Reich, while homosexuals were certainly persecuted and victims,
Yeah.
It's not perhaps the best term to talk about a homosexual Holocaust.
Right.
That's a phrase.
Right.
And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about survival rates for those who
Yeah.
go into camps, and also this history. I mean, it's a fascinating history that you're still uncovering today. Could you talk a little bit about the challenges to researching this and what happened more in the post-war period, the repression of this history, and the challenges that are intended with this kind of research?
Yeah. Certainly there was no Homocaust. This was stated by some of the new gay rights groups in the 1970s, that homosexuals were hounded as much as Jews. They were sent to their deaths. There was a real Homocaust. This is just part of the effort to get recognition for gay groups at the time. As I've said, there were Himmler claims in 1933 already that there are 2 million homosexual men in Germany, which is probably about correct. I mean, if we take 3 or 4% of the population, yes, there are probably 2 or 3 million homosexuals. The police only ever succeeded in arresting 100,000 men on charges of homosexual activity. So most gay men managed to stay underground, to stay hidden, not to come to the notice of other people. We know that there were still tiny groups of gay men who met, had parties together, socialized and so on, but in secret. So with the stereotypes that they handed out to the police against hairdressers and waiters and so on, all of which were wrong, they never succeeded in identifying who is a homosexual. When cases began to turn up in the SS, Heinrich Himmler was baffled and said, you know, these people have passed these very stringent racial tests to become members of this elite. So how can they be gay? There must be, something's wrong with the definition here. And he decided that there was a small minority of real homosexuals, and the vast majority of people who were accused were temporarily led astray and could be brought back into the fold, as it were, could be re-educated, which might have meant a brief prison sentence, or he used to send some of his SS men for a month in a concentration camp as an inmate. Thinking, yeah, that'll straighten them out. And of course, people then said, oh yeah, this has worked. I'm not gay anymore. I now see the error of my ways. So it became very difficult to identify who was homosexual. Himmler had various draconian measures, such as he threatened already in 1936 that if any SS member was found guilty of a homosexual offense, they would be sent to a concentration camp and shot while trying to escape. But that never happened. He then in 1941 had an automatic death sentence for any members of the police or SS found guilty of a homosexual offense. I've published an article about that in the Journal of the History of Sexuality. Again, he didn't follow through with this. Yes, some men were shot, but the majority were not. He would excuse them because they'd been drunk at the time. He would excuse them because they were married and had children, so they couldn't possibly be a real homosexual. So there's no consistent policy as there is with Jews. It depended on the courts, it depended on Himmler's whim, and so on. This was not a major obsession of Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler didn't really like the idea of homosexuals and ranted about it at length when the subject was raised, but then let it drop. He wasn't constantly thinking about this. Heinrich Himmler, I think, was. And I thought until very recently that this had come about whilst he was a fraternity student in the 1920s, and we know from his diary, we know Himmler made notes on every book that he was reading. He was a voracious reader and made notes and comments on each book, whether he liked it and so on. And one of his fraternity brothers gave him a book dealing with the question of homosexuality. And he notes that he just went to bed with a headache. It just really upset him, and he thought this was terrible. But the discussion of the homosexual problem was very valid and something that he needed to pay attention to. So this is in the early 20s. I just saw recently, I got a DVD when I was in Germany this summer. There's a documentary called Der Anständige, the Decent Man, about Heinrich Himmler. It's based on his letters to his wife and family, and other writings that I was not aware of, and I don't think that Peter Longerich refers to in his biography. It turns out that in 1919 already, he went to college and was trying to get into a fraternity, and it looked as though they were going to accept him. He sat at the top table with the officers of the fraternity, and he was very pleased, and he said that the discussion ranged around a number of subjects such as land reform, the Jewish question, and homosexuality. And obviously he kind of embraced all the points that the senior fraternity members were discussing. And this is already in 1919 that he's aware of the homosexual problem. In the end, the fraternity didn't accept him as a full member, and he writes in his diary, "I know why. It's because I talk too much, and they rejected me." But it's interesting that very early on, he is aware of this problem and kind of takes it on board and then adds it to all the things where he's trying to outdo Adolf Hitler himself in ideological purity and become a more eager, keen, pure National Socialist than even the head of the party. And so it does become an obsession with him. Early on, when the Nazis come to power in 1933. And he, of course, is the main force, the SS is the main force behind the murder of Ernst Röhm, the leader of the stormtroopers in June 1934. After the war, yes, a couple of words about that. I mean, the Allies order the Germans to delete from the criminal code all paragraphs that had been added or changed after the Nazis came to power, which made them harsher, which imposed harsher punishments. And we can certainly say that about paragraph 175, but the Germans did not do this. In fact, they did not, whereas the Allies, when they liberated the concentration camps, wanted everybody to go free, it turns out that the Germans said, well, your spell in the concentration camp didn't count towards your prison sentence, and so you homosexuals need to go back in jail as sex criminals, even though a lot of the charges had been politically motivated and were trumped up. You need to go back and finish off your sentence. And so many of these Pink Triangle prisoners were sent back to jail. Which is something that's sometimes blamed on the Allies, but in fact came at the behest of the Germans themselves. And they did not amend the law. They were ordered by the Allied Control Council to delete provisions dealing with castration already in 1945, but the rest was allowed to stand for various reasons. Yes, question right there.
Could you speak about Ernst Röhm and how open he was about his sexual orientation, and how much do you think he was persecuted, whether it was because of his sexual orientation or his rivalry within the party? Yeah. And a related question would be, we're talking about Himmler and Hitler, and I guess I'm wondering, given that Ernst Röhm did have such prestige early on before he was murdered, when and where do you think the persecution of homosexuals began within the Nazi leadership, and who do you think the source is, if we can pinpoint that?
Hitler knew about Ernst Röhm early on, and it was not a big deal for him. He was a very competent leader of the stormtroopers. He gained a lot of support for the party. He did a lot of good for the Nazi party in terms of just the thuggery that took place, beating up opponents and so on. And so he was useful to Hitler. Hitler knew about, there was a big campaign in the social democratic press, the oppositional press, revealing him to be a homosexual, even though Röhm was quite discreet in his sexual activity and got friends of his to arrange for partners in their apartments for him to meet. So Hitler was not particularly concerned. The reason he was murdered was because the military leaders, the army generals, feared that the stormtroopers, now with well over 1 million members, was going to take the place, and they thought that Ernst Röhm wanted to become the head of the military, which, you remember, was restricted to a mere 100,000 men under the Versailles Treaty at the end of the war. So the army generals wanted to get rid of him, and this was the reason that Himmler had one of his only really close friends murdered. After which he then made a speech in public highlighting Röhm's homosexuality and saying, as I said to the students this afternoon, in public, in his public address on the radio, that he did this because of the conspiracy that homosexuals have to take over the government and the party, but he also wanted to make the Hitler Youth a safe place for mothers to send their sons. So again, highlighting the stereotype that all homosexuals are pedophiles, which was not the case with Ernst Röhm. So as to the sexuality of the others, I mean, certainly not Heinrich Himmler, who was such a vigorous heterosexual that he thought he was too good to have one wife and was persuaded by Martin Bormann that he ought to have a mistress as well and have more children with her, as Martin Bormann himself had done. And the rumors that crop up periodically that Hitler was gay are also nonsense. So.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
So we look at, we look at the Holocaust and we see the persecution of Jews transcending borders as the regime expands. Does this also happen? Because you said that the persecution of homosexuals largely depended on denunciations. So how did that work when the regime was expanding? Did the persecution of homosexuals happen in Poland and France?
Okay. Yep, another good question. And I've addressed that in part in the, what's it called, Grey something or other. What? Grey Zones, yeah, in a book that, that a certain person has helped edit. Yes, the Hitler, again, didn't particularly show any concern for the fact that there may be homosexuals in the Soviet Union. He thought, aha, because these men do not produce children to swell the ranks of the army, which is our problem here in Germany, this will be the problem in the Soviet Union. Just as he, you know, he was a teetotaler, but he was very happy about the fact that a lot of Russians were drinking themselves to death with vodka. So we do not have such a vigorous prosecution of homosexuals in the occupied territories unless they form liaisons with Germans, with German soldiers usually. And often, I mean, if there are a whole slew of cases on German soldiers in the military archives, some of which I've looked at, and they are given surprisingly harsh sentences, often death sentences, but not quite so harsh to the Poles or others, depending in part on their race. Scandinavian countries, the men there are viewed as Aryan. But very, very slender evidence there, but in one case, for example, in Oslo, I think, the German gets, this is in 1945 even, the German gets a 10-year penitentiary sentence, so he would have been in prison till 1955. The Norwegian gets a 10-year prison sentence, so not as harsh as the penitentiary with hard labor, but still a pretty stiff sentence. So there is some differentiation there on what the Nazis would describe as racial grounds. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. Some interesting questions there. And a pleasure to be here again. Thank you.